So I've been seeing a lot of things talking of people making commentary. Interestingly enough, the ones I've noticed that have been making the commentary are wealthy black people making the commentary about we should not be rioting, we should not be looting, we should not be tearing up our own communities. And then there's been an argument of the other side of we should be hitting them in the pocket. We should be focusing on the blackout days where we don't spend money. But you know, I feel like we should do both. And I feel like I support both. And I'll tell you why I support both. I support both because when you have a civil unrest like this, there are three types of people in the streets. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices, and they are there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists, who really just want to fuck shit up, and that's what they're going to do regardless. And then you have the looters. And the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. Now, people are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why, and that's my issue with that. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, well, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then, let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're gonna get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot, that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need. And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything. And then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood, how can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the fuck do I give a shit about burning the fucking Football Hall of Fame, about burning a fucking Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so fuck your Target. Fuck your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
Let's talk about structural violence. The term structural violence was first coined by Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung in his 1969 article, Violence, Peace, and Peace Research. Structural violence refers to harm caused by social structures and institutions that prevent people from meeting their basic needs and achieving their full potential. It's a form of violence that is often invisible and embedded into the very fabric of society. Galtung defines structural violence as any constraint on human potential due to economic and political structures. He emphasized how social institutions can prevent individuals and groups from meeting their basic needs. He differentiated structural violence from direct violence, for example, physical assault, highlighting that structural violence is often invisible and embedded within social norms. He also distinguished direct violence and structural violence from cultural violence. Cultural violence refers to aspects of a culture that can be used to justify or legitimize direct or structural violence. Cultural violence manifests in various forms. These can include language, derogatory terms or stereotypes used to dehumanize certain groups. Religion, religious doctrines that justify violence or discrimination against non-believers or different sects. Art and media, representations that glorify violence or depict certain groups as inferior. Education, curriculums that ignore or misrepresent the history and contributions of marginalized groups. Symbols, flags, monuments, and other symbols that represent and preserve historically oppressed regimes and ideologies. Cultural violence is often invisible and insidious. Future Lauren Hare. The word is pronounced insidious. Insidious. Making it difficult to recognize and address. It can be embedded in everyday language, social norms, and cultural practices, shaping our perceptions and attitudes towards others. Cultural violence is only one level of oppression. To learn more about oppression, you can reference it in this video here, where we talk about the cultural and symbolic level of oppression, and other forms. But now, let's return to structural violence. In the 1970s and 1980s, scholars expanded on Galtung's ideas, exploring the relationship between structural violence and issues like poverty, health disparities, and discrimination. The term became increasingly linked to social justice movements, highlighting how systemic inequalities perpetuate harm. Today, structural violence is understood as encompassing a wide range of social, economic, and political structures that create and perpetuate inequality. Scholars recognize how different forms of structural violence intersect and compound each other, creating complex and overlapping systems of oppression. But what are the key characteristics of structural violence? It's systemic. It's not about individual acts of violence, but rather about the way social systems are organized to create and perpetuate inequality. It's indirect. The harm is not inflicted directly by a person, but through the operation of social structures. It's invisible. Structural violence is often normalized and invisible, making it difficult to address. It's rooted in power imbalances and systemic inequalities. Structural violence has significant consequences for individuals and communities, impacting physical and mental health, life expectancy, and overall well-being. Structural violence is avoidable. The suffering caused by structural violence is preventable through social change and policy interventions. And it has real and measurable negative impacts on people's lives, including increased morbidity and mortality. The concept of structural violence remains a powerful tool for understanding and addressing social injustice and inequality. It encourages us to look beyond individual acts of violence and examine the underlying systems that create and perpetuate harm. But what are some examples of structural violence? Poverty and financial oppression are definitely forms of structural violence. Economic systems create and maintain vast disparities in wealth, leaving some people without access to basic necessities like food, shelter, and healthcare. Systemic disadvantage. Financial oppression is often built into the very structures of society, such as discriminatory lending practices, unequal access to education and job opportunities, and tax policies that favor the wealthy. These systems create and perpetuate financial inequality, disproportionately impacting marginalized communities. While financial oppression may not involve physical violence, it can be just as harmful and have long-lasting consequences. It limits opportunities, undermines well-being, and reinforces social inequalities. Recognizing financial oppression as a form of structural violence is crucial to addressing its root causes and working together to a more just and equitable society. Other examples of structural violence: racism. Social and institutional practices that discriminate against people based on their race, leading to unequal opportunities and outcomes. Sexism. Discrimination based on gender that limits women's access to education, employment, and political participation. Healthcare disparities. Unequal access to quality healthcare based on factors like race, income, and geographic location, amongst others. Environmental injustice. The disproportionate exposure of marginalized communities to environmental hazards. What is the impact of structural violence? Increased morbidity and mortality. Structural violence can lead to higher rates of disease, disability, and premature death. Reduced quality of life. It can limit people's opportunities, create stress and anxiety, and diminish one's overall well-being. Social unrest. Structural violence can contribute to social conflict and instability. But how do we address structural violence? Awareness. Recognizing and understanding the pervasive nature of structural violence is the first step toward addressing it. Advocacy. Working to change policies and practices that perpetuate inequality. Empowerment. Supporting marginalized communities to gain control over their lives and advocate for their rights. In essence, structural violence is a complex and deeply ingrained form of violence that requires systemic solutions. By understanding its causes and consequences, we can work towards creating a more just and equitable society for all. But what are your initial reflections? Did anything you hear stand out, make you think, or bring up any questions? Please add any thoughts in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, watch the next video. Much thanks for joining. Be well.